All right, a couple of weeks ago we started looking at the story of Esther, and one of the things that we saw was that Esther's world was not that much different from ours in this respect. In Esther's world, which they were in exile, and they were in the capital city of Susa there during the reign of the Medes and the Persians, and for a lot of the people there, appearance was reality. In other words, the way you looked, how you looked, was who you are, was who you were perceived to be. And that's the case in our society as well. We're so focused on our image and on how we appear and how other people perceive us. And a lot of times we become slaves to that, and we become so wrapped up in maintaining a certain kind of image and a certain kind of status, and we're so willing to go to ridiculous lengths to maintain our image and our status. We drive ourselves into debt up to our eyeballs, and we make our spouses so incredibly frustrated because we're just anxious and neurotic almost about how we're perceived, and we'll invest so much time and so much energy in what we do with our physical bodies and how we present our physical bodies, and we don't spend that much time working on the interior, on who we really are. But God's agenda for you is not just that you look good, but I will say this: God is concerned with what you do with your body. Don't get me wrong. God is concerned and wants you to be a good steward of the resources and talents He's given you, and one of the resources He's given you is a body, and hopefully that body works more often than it does not. And so it would be wise for you to cultivate your body as a stewardship. But what God is mostly interested in is the kind of person you're becoming on the inside. And so I challenged you a couple of weeks ago with 3 things that I thought going into the summer would be wise for us to do. And the first one was to stop treating other people on the basis of how they look. And we can do that positively. We can treat people better because they look better. Or sometimes we can do it negatively as well. Sometimes we can look at people who are attractive and make assumptions about them that they're shallow, and we get envious and we get petty and competitive. So I just asked you to stop treating others on the basis of how they look. The second thing was spend as much time cultivating your heart as you do cultivating your body. And that can be a really hard thing to do. I mean, if you just take an inventory of everything you do, getting ready and staying ready and doing your hair and your makeup and your nails and workout and all that kind of stuff, if you just catalog that for a week, you'll see it could be very difficult for you to spend that much time working on who you are and your character development. And we're going to talk some tonight about some things that you can do that will help that. But the third habit I challenged you to cultivate was learning to live as someone who is beautiful in the eyes of God. And that one can often be the hardest of all, because we're surrounded by a culture that tells us that how you look is who you are. And yet we serve a God who sees past the exterior and sees into our hearts and sees the potential that we have there and sees His own image that is indelibly stamped on our hearts and says, I love you with an unending love, with a never-ending love, with an all-consuming love. And so when we look in the mirror, the challenge is to look past all the flab and the bad haircut and the whatever and all the things that we'd like to change about ourselves and see ourselves the way God sees us. So those were 3 habits that I challenged you with. And what I want to talk about tonight is how God transforms us into people who have a bold and courageous faith. Really, how God grows us up, because that's God's primary concern for us, is that we grow in our likeness to Jesus, that we become more like Jesus. That's why I pray every week that we'll leave this place looking more like Jesus than when we got here. And so I want to look at how God does that, especially in a world that is so enslaved to physical appearances. And I think Esther provides us with a really great lens through which we can see the catalysts for spiritual growth that God frequently uses. Because God doesn't want us to be timid or afraid or overly concerned with how other people perceive us and be constantly bound up by our image and appearance. Now, just a little context here. Before we get into Esther, you'll remember Esther happens while they're in exile. So they're far, far away from home, and there is no hope of them returning back to their homeland. In fact, there's no mention in the book of Esther of Jerusalem. There's no mention of the temple. There's no mention of priests and sacrifices. In fact, the book of Esther, this is a little piece of trivia for you. The book of Esther is the only book in the Bible that never mentions God by name. Several years ago in our small group, remember our small group, we did a study of all the names of God in the whole Bible, and one of the things we would do is every week we'd look at one book and see how God is named in that book. And Esther is the only book in the whole Bible that never mentions God by name. Now what's interesting is that doesn't mean that God's not in there. Because once you know where to look, you'll see him everywhere. God is often like that though. God is constantly at work, but he frequently works in hidden and unseen ways. God is not a glory hound. God does not have to be. He frequently is content to sit behind the scenes and work behind the scenes. And that's the way he works here in the book of Esther. Now, Esther was chosen to be the new queen. You remember there was a queen and her name was Vashti. And there was a king and his name was Xerxes. And Xerxes was kind of a frat boy king, and we talked about how you could outline the book by a series of parties. And so Xerxes liked to throw all these great parties, and one time he's having a party and everyone's hammered, and he decides, oh, I'll bring my prize trophy wife in here, and she'll parade around in front of all my drunk frat boy friends, and that'll be great. She'll love that, won't she? And so he calls her, and she says, no, thank you, not very much. And so he has her deposed. He has her kicked out, and he says, now I need a new queen. What will I do? And his advisors say, I know what we'll do. We'll have a beauty contest, and whoever wins the swimsuit competition will become the next queen. And so they go around all the provinces, and you remember how many provinces there were? 127. 127 provinces. So there's a big group of women who are brought to the capital city, and Esther, out of all these women, Esther is the one who is chosen, and she's chosen just because she's pretty. That's really what it comes down to. Esther is pretty, and she's prettier than all the others, and that's why she gets to be the queen. Now, Xerxes thinks he's chosen someone who buys into the same value system that he does, because his value system, his belief system is real simple. How you look is who you are. And so if you're beautiful, you must be fit to be the queen. You get to be the queen. That's his belief system. Now, he doesn't know what he's in for, because he had no idea that sometimes looks can be deceiving. Several years ago, there was actually a mix-up. And this, unlike some of my stories, this one is actually true, so this will be good. There was a mix-up in a toy manufacturer, the plant rather, and the little voice boxes. You remember that you'd pull the string and it would. So the voice boxes, I'm not making this up, from G.I. Joes got swapped with the voice boxes from Barbies. And so imagine, how weird that would be, for your 8-year-old boy to pull the string on G.I. Joe and he says, let's go shopping. And for your little girl to pull the voice box, pull the string on Barbie and she says, hit the ground hard, 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 Sometimes looks can be deceiving, and what we're going to see tonight is how you become a warrior in a Barbie doll kind of world. Because the king thinks he's getting Barbie, but he pulls the string, and out comes the voice of a warrior, okay? And that's really and so we're going to look at the process that God uses to create something like that in us. So, okay, the characters that we have so far. We have Vashti, and she's been deposed. We have the king, King Xerxes. And we have the new queen, and her name is Esther. And we have another character. Remember, Esther has a guardian, and his name is Mordecai. Right, okay. And he's either her uncle or her cousin. The Hebrew words are the same. He's her guardian. He kind of raised her as his own. And we learn from chapter 2, verse 19, that he used to sit in the king's gate, which was kind of a technical term that probably meant he didn't just loiter at the king's gate. He probably had a job there. So he was probably a government official of some kind. And an interesting thing happens at the end of chapter 2. There is a plot to assassinate the king. And Mordecai overhears it and uncovers it and goes and reports it. And so Mordecai saves the king's life. And it gets written down in the official records for the state. And that's important because that'll come back in a little bit. Okay, so chapter 3, we introduce a new character. Chapter 3, verse 1. After these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than that of all the other nobles. So he's the second in command now. Now all the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. Now, okay, so we've got this new character. His name is Haman, and he's the second in command, and everybody bows down to him except this one guy, Mordecai. Now, this is a problem because Haman buys into the prevailing belief system that how you look is who you are. And one person out there not bowing down to him makes him look bad, and this tears him up. This is just intolerable. No matter the fact that he's been elevated to this huge level of status, if there's one person out there who doesn't believe that the world revolves around me, I'm miserable. And that's pretty much Haman. What a terrible way to go through your life. And yet there are so many people for whom this is life. If there's one person out there who doesn't like me or think I'm the coolest guy or think I should be emperor of the universe, then it keeps me up at night. And the best thing you can do, if that's you, let it go. Okay? Let it go. Because otherwise it'll just make you a miserable, miserable person. Okay, verse 5. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Who's in control of Haman's life right now? Mordecai is in. That's the thing. No, if you surrender that to other people, and there are lots of people that I encounter on a daily basis, they're not in control of their own lives. There's somebody out there who gets to push all their buttons. So Mordecai is pushing all of Haman's buttons. Yet, having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. How many provinces? 127. So he's talking about a full-scale Holocaust here. This is big and bad and scary, all because there's one guy out there who refuses to pay him honor. Okay? So he decides, this is what we're going to do. We're going to exterminate all of them. When should we start? And they kind of spiritualize it. Let's let the gods decide. So they cast lots. Verse 7 says, in the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, the pur, that is, the lot, was cast in the presence of Haman to select a day and a month when they would begin this extermination process. And the lot fell on the 12th month, the month of Adair. Okay? And that's important. The casting of lots and pur is important. That'll come back later as well. This story is really well written, by the way. If you just look at it from a literary perspective, this is told and written with such amazing skill. That's really fascinating. Okay, so they cast the lots, and then he goes to the king in verse 8. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, "There is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom, who keep themselves separate." That's true. "Their customs are different from those of all the other people," and that's true too. "And they do not obey the king's laws." Now that's false. See, this is the way deception frequently works. There's usually a little bit of truth, a little bit of truth, a little bit of truth, and then they twist it. That's the way Satan likes to work, okay? There's a little bit of truth, and then they twist it, and that's false. "It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them." And in verse 9, he offers him a bribe. "If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury." Now, I have a footnote, by the way, that says this is about 375 tons of silver. He wants this to happen badly. I mean, that's a lot of money, okay? Now, the question is, why does it even occur to you to offer a bribe? Well, either you think the king is corrupt and needs to be bribed in order to do the right thing, or you think the offer is corrupt and the king needs to be bribed in order to do the wrong thing. You see what I'm saying? So this is not starting well for him. He's not starting with honest intentions. He's either trying to do business with a guy he thinks is a crook, which would be an insult to the king, or he realizes this is not a moral choice that I'm trying to get the king to do here. So he offers him this huge bribe of 375 tons of silver. Verse 10. So the king took his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. Now, Haman has a new nickname, by the way. Did you notice that? What's his new nickname? Enemy of the Jews. I would just assert that if you're ever going to have a nickname, that would not be a good one. Okay? No one who has ever been set up as the enemy of the Jews ended well. Okay? So, enemy of the Jews, he is. And listen what the king says, verse 11. Keep the money, the king said to Haman, and do with the people as you please. I get the impression that Haman is watching television or something. Just go away. Just do it, okay? I don't care. See, the king, I would suggest, is not corrupt. He's just dumb. He's shallow, really, is what he is. He's not corrupt inherently. He's not evil. He's not like, oh, yes, that would be a terribly wicked thing to do. Let's do that. He just can't be bothered with things because he's too busy preoccupied with whatever. He's, watching Baywatch or whatever, And so he just says, yeah, okay, fine, whatever. Here's a blank check. Go and do whatever you want, okay? Because in his world, again, how you look is who you are. And if it looks like I'm concentrating on things too hard, I might get a wrinkle right here, and then it won't, that won't be good. So, word gets out, word starts to spread about this new plan to exterminate all the Jews. Look at chapter 4, verse 1. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. But, this is great, he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. Don't let people who are dressed in shabby clothes in because they bum me out. I can just imagine the king saying that, because in this world, in this society, how you look is who you are. And if you're dressed like that, you don't get in to see the king, right? Because they're so concerned with appearance. So, which just sounds like something, Paris Hilton would say or something. So, I don't like people who are sad. Verse 3. In every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews and fasting, weeping and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. Now, this was kind of their way of protesting. This was like a sit-in or, something for them. I watched a great documentary last night on PBS. They had a great documentary on Martin Luther King Jr. Anybody see that? Yeah, it was fascinating. And but he did not invent passive resistance, nonviolence. That's actually that's what they're doing here. They are nonviolent and they're passively resisting this law. This is their way of protesting this. Word gets to Esther in the palace now, and Mordecai sends her a message. Look at verse 8. Mordecai gave the messenger a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain it to her. And he told the messenger to instruct her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. So think about this. The fate of God's people, all the promises of God, all the people of God, this great plan that God put in place all the way back when he came to Abraham in 1200 BC. Now we're almost 800 years later, okay? And that plan has come down to this tiny thread. This woman stands between the promise of God being fulfilled and the annihilation of the people. That's how thin it is. Now, can you imagine what would have happened if Esther had simply said, well, listen, if God wants us to be saved, he'll save us. And if God wants us to be killed, he'll let us all get killed. And so the best thing for me to do is just sit real still. That would sound real spiritual, wouldn't it? But what would have happened? You see? Now, what if Martin Luther King Jr. had said, listen, if God wants black people to vote and be able to enjoy the same rights and privileges that all the other American citizens enjoy, then he will cause that to happen somehow. And if he doesn't, then we won't. And so the best thing for me to do is just sit real still. What would have happened? You see, frequently God brings us to these critical crossroads in life. And he says, it's time to choose. Are you going to remain passive and allow life to happen to you, Or are you going to become proactive and take a stand over this? Okay? So God is calling Esther to take a stand. And frequently the way he does it, by the way, is not necessarily through a dream or a vision or something like that, but he does it oftentimes through a tough, loving, but fully devoted friend. Mordecai comes and pokes her. Esther, it's up to you. And she has a choice now. Do I listen to him or do I ignore him? But he's going to stay here and he's not going to go away. Now, she pushes back initially, okay? Initially, she resists. Look at verse 11. She gives him some information. All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. Okay? And listen to this piece of information, though. 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. That's fascinating, isn't it? Because they're newlyweds. And she hadn't even seen him in 30 days. I would suggest that maybe the novelty has worn off a little bit. Because listen, in a society where how you look is who you are, it doesn't breed deep relationships. Okay, deep relationships are difficult to sustain in a society like that. Instead, what you get are shallow, superficial relationships. Been there, done that, what's next? I've already been the whole Esther, all that. I'm done with her. The new is worn off. Now I'm looking for what's next. Because that's what happens in a society where how you look is who you are. So she gives Mordecai this piece of information that he didn't know. He probably knew that first part, that anybody who goes in to see him and they're not summoned, he probably knew that part. But this last piece, he didn't really know. Okay? Esther is afraid, but Mordecai continues. And he says, you have to go. Esther has good reasons not to go. And Mordecai could have backed off, by the way. He could have said, oh, well, in that case, all right, never mind. But he doesn't. Look at verse 12. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to a royal position for such a time as this. Now I want you to notice he does a couple of things. He affirms the sovereignty of God. Okay? He does that. But he also says that doesn't negate the importance of human responsibility. Okay? Listen, if God wants something to happen, it's going to happen. Okay? If God can cause anything to happen that he wants to happen. But you'll lose out on the very purpose for which you were created. And so he affirms both of those, and he challenges her to do something more important than just sit up there and look pretty. He asks her, he pushes her, he nudges her to participate in God's story, to get involved in what God is doing, because you are created to be more than a beauty queen. Okay? Good friends do that. Good friends keep you from settling, from selling yourself short, from being passive. And so here's a question for you. Who plays the role of Mordecai for you? Do you have anyone in your life who challenges you that way? Who says, stop settling and stop setting the bar so low for your life. Stop being content with just going through the motions and looking pretty, and get busy, get involved in what God is doing. Because you have so much potential, you don't want to get to the end of your life and look back and see a series of critical opportunities and defining moments that you said no to. Do you have someone in your life who plays the role of Mordecai? And there's a verse in the Proverbs 27:17 says, as iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. Now, you notice it does not say, as flannel sharpens flannel. because flannel doesn't sharpen anything. Now, flannel feels real nice. Okay, it's soft and it feels great, rub up against flannel, but it doesn't make you any sharper. And so I'm not asking you, who do you feel most comfortable around? And there may be a place for that, but I'm asking you, who challenges you? Sometimes sparks may fly, but that's how people get sharpened. One of the catalysts for spiritual growth that God frequently uses is this kind of a relationship, a challenging relationship with a very devoted but tough-loving friend. And we could go around this room and we could all probably name someone who played that role for us at once in our lives. And maybe I grew so much when I really got connected with that one guy or that one woman or that one person out there who challenged me to go deeper in my relationship with God or to get more active in living out my faith. We can all point to one person at some point in times in our lives, or at least most of us probably could. I'm asking you, do you have anyone who plays that role now? And if you do, let them know how much you appreciate them and give them permission to speak hard truth into your life. And if you don't have someone, get in a small group and look around. Because those kinds of people are available. They're really hard to find when we're sitting in a large group setting staring at the back of somebody else's head. Okay? Really hard to find somebody like that. Get in a small group where you're more likely to find someone and ask, is that the person? Is that the person? Could that be the person who serves this role in my life? Because everybody needs someone who will be Mordecai and refuse to bow down to us. So God's goal is to grow us up, not to make us more comfortable, but to shape our character. And one of the ways He frequently uses is through the challenge of a relationship like that. Okay? Now, a second catalyst for spiritual growth is something that already is happening in Esther's life here. God will frequently bring us to a pivotal circumstance. And it's oftentimes a crisis. In fact, studies have been done, and I participated in one a couple of years ago where we went around and we asked hundreds, thousands of people, tell us times when you grew spiritually more than any other. And the number one thing that people pointed to as a catalyst for spiritual growth was difficult circumstances. It was the death of my mom, or it was the loss of my spouse, or it was, the time I got laid off, or the time I went through that awful nightmare in my work, or those difficult circumstances have a way, after we look back on them, of growing us tremendously. Now, I'll quickly say this. Difficult circumstances don't automatically grow you. Sometimes, I've known people who go, we were talking about this before. If it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger. That's not true. I know plenty of people who managed to get through something. They came out weak, frayed, timid, fearful, bitter, more impoverished than when they went into it. Okay? What makes the difference is how we respond to these circumstances. Okay? How we respond and how we view these circumstances. That's why James says, listen, when a difficult time comes your way, you ought to receive it as a blessing, knowing that God can use this to increase your endurance. Okay? You ought to receive these things. You ought to welcome them as blessed opportunities to grow. Now, again, it doesn't always happen, and I'll quickly say this as well. God doesn't cause difficult circumstances. Not all the time. Sometimes He does, and sometimes He doesn't. I don't think God caused Haman to do this. I don't think God caused the Holocaust in Germany in World War II. I don't think God caused Hurricane Katrina. I don't believe God causes those kinds of things. But in the alchemy of God, He has a way of taking these difficult circumstances and refining them into precious things. You ask people down on the Gulf Coast, was that a blessing or a storm? And they'll tell you, it was a storm. Many, many blessings have come in its wake. And there is tremendous opportunity for people to grow as a result of it, but that's not something that God created. Okay, God didn't cause that. And I don't think God caused Haman to do what he did here, but God can use it to grow us up. Now, our response to suffering and to hardships determines, to a large extent, whether we'll grow from them or not. And Esther could have panicked. Or she could have buried her head in the sand and stuck her hands in her ears and gone, la, 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 I'm not listening. But she didn't. Instead, she chose to face it head on. And the question for you here is, how do you respond to crisis? When things don't go your way, what do? You start yelling at God automatically? Where are you? How could you let this happen? What's going on? I thought you were a good God. I thought you were loving. Is that how you respond? What is a Christ-like response to difficult circumstances? God, if there's any way that this doesn't have to happen, please, some other way, but not my will, but yours. And if I must endure this, show me how I can grow as a result of it. Sometimes God, there was a song that came out a couple of years ago. Sometimes God calms the storm, and sometimes He calms us. And so it's appropriate to ask periodically, God, could you just make this storm go away? And sometimes He chooses to do that. But if not, can you at least help me calm down? Can you at least help me see this from your perspective and see the blessings that can come as a result of these difficult circumstances? Your perspective on a crisis will determine in a large extent whether or not that becomes a catalyst for spiritual growth or not. Okay? Now here's what Esther does. The crisis comes. Esther is challenged by this tough, loving friend, and she becomes active. Look at verse 16. Verse 15, Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. And when this is done, I will go to the king, even though it's against the law. And if I perish, I perish. One catalyst for spiritual growth is engaging in spiritual disciplines, by the way. Like, I remember the first time I ever took the idea of fasting seriously. I actually began to practice that in my life. It's a time of tremendous growth. When you really devote yourself to an extended period of prayer, whether it's 40 days of prayer or one of those kinds of programs, you'll find you grow in tremendous leaps and bounds. And one of the reasons why is because spiritual disciplines like prayer and fasting that she chooses here remind us that we're weak and can't fix this on our own. That's what spiritual disciplines remind us, that we are insufficient for the task at hand, because God strengthens those who acknowledge their weakness. This is what he said to Paul, my strength is perfected in your weakness. So here's a question for you. When was the last time you acknowledged that you couldn't do something and you asked somebody else to pray for you? Because I'll tell you, life is hard. I mean, that's just the truth. Life is hard. Being married is hard. Raising kids is hard. Being single and maintaining your purity is hard. These are difficult. Holiness is hard. And I can't accomplish it in my own strength. I can't be the dad I need to be. I can't be the husband I need to be. I can't do these things in my own strength. And I have to acknowledge that. It's not like God is up there waiting for information. God, I can't do this. Oh, you can't? I thought you could. Okay, well, that makes sense now. God is not up there waiting for us. He knows that we need to acknowledge our inadequacy. And He strengthens those who acknowledge their weakness. And so in that sense, practicing spiritual disciplines is not a sign of maturity. I fast 3 days a week. Wow, you must be super weak. I mean, that's what that means. Spiritual disciplines are not a sign of maturity. They're a sign of weakness, and because they're a sign of weakness, they become a pathway to maturity. Does that make sense? Okay? So people who claim, I'm a spiritual giant because I practice these spiritual disciplines, you've got the spiritual disciplines backwards. It's not spiritual giants who practice the disciplines. It's people who practice the disciplines who become spiritual giants. Okay? One comes first and then the other. So she chooses to act here. Now it's interesting. Esther is challenged by this tough, loving friend. She faces this crisis. She engages in spiritual disciplines. And then she chooses to act. And she takes responsible action. Look back at verse 16 here again. She says, go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Don't eat or drink for 3 days, night and day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it's against the law. And if I perish, I'll perish. She says, I'm going to take responsibility for this. I'm going to stop allowing life to happen to me, and I'm going to take the initiative. Now, it's interesting because this is kind of a hinge for the story. Because up to this point, Esther has been pretty passive. If you go back to chapter 2, just for a second, go back to chapter 2 and look at this. Chapter 2, verse 10 says, Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. She's taking orders from Mordecai. Look at chapter 4, verse 8. Mordecai, he gives this copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show Esther and explain it to her, and he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy. She's taking orders again. Now look at verse 17 of chapter 4. Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. Now we've swapped roles. Now Esther is not waiting to receive orders from somebody else and allowing life to happen to her. She's now giving orders, and she's assuming responsibility here. She's moving forward in action. And see, wise people know there are 3 levels to living, okay? And wise people travel through all 3 of these. The first level is survival. We all struggle for survival. And in that level of living, maintaining your life, that's the highest goal possible. Then the second level is the level of success. And achieving success at all costs, that becomes our ultimate goal. Wise people move past those 2 into the third level, which is seeking significance. And when you seek significance, now my number one objective, and the primary thing to be avoided, is no longer death or failure, but it's disobedience. Because disobedience always robs me of the opportunity to participate in something truly significant, in something that's truly going to leave a lasting mark. If all you ever do is live for success, you'll be trying to make a permanent mark using a dry erase marker. It'll never last. You can't make a permanent mark with a crayon. You're using the wrong tools. So Esther decides she's going to start living for significance because disobedience costs more than either death or failure for her. So now she starts giving orders. And the interesting thing is, God is the one who's actually going to do this. God's the one who's actually going to accomplish this. And God's going to be the one who saves the day. And God's going to be the one who gets the glory. But frequently, God works as people take initiative. As people take, in other words, if you look at the New Testament especially, and how people come to faith, nobody in the New Testament comes to faith apart from a relationship with another person. Even if you think of Saul on the road to Damascus, God himself knocks him off his high horse, but God doesn't tell him what to do to be saved. What does God do? God sends him to a person. God could have done it. Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8, okay? The Ethiopian eunuch is riding along, reading the book of Isaiah. God himself knows where he is and sees him and says, Philip, go over there. Why don't you do it, God? Because that's not the way God operates. More often than not, God works through human agents. And that's how he accomplishes his purposes in this world. So Esther chooses to take action, and in doing so, signs up, hitches her wagon to this star, and says, God is going to do it, but he's going to do this through me. And frequently people come to these pivotal circumstances, and sometimes these pivotal circumstances are huge, like it is with Esther here. I'll just tell you something that I've experienced more often than not. These pivotal circumstances, these critical crossroads, feel more like interruptions than like big, giant things. You think about Moses at the burning bush. Moses had to turn aside off of his path to get to the burning bush. He could have ignored it and kept walking. In fact, maybe he did for several days, and after a few weeks he thought, that bush is still burning. I better go see what's going on. But it wasn't until he turned aside that God spoke out of the burning bush. God didn't say, hey, Moses, over here. Woohoo! The burning bush, come on, over here. No, God waited for Moses to turn aside. And I wonder how many divine opportunities do I miss? I'm so focused on where I'm going. And this seems to be more of a distraction than an opportunity. And God is waiting for me to turn aside and say, is this you, God? See, if you wake up every morning and you say, all right, God, you tell me where to go and I'll go, you tell me what to do and I'll do, and you get 5 voicemail from somebody, what are you going to do? Say, go away, I'm waiting for God? And maybe it's time for you to take a step of initiative and say, all right, is this God or is this a distraction? God frequently works through humans who will take a step of initiative. Okay? God has brought each of us to a specific place at a specific time, and maybe we ought to ask, okay, what's the reason? Why am I here right now? Why are you here right now? Maybe it's a big, life-altering, huge thing, or maybe it's not. Maybe it's a subtle, little thing. Why does God have you working where you work? Why does God have you married to the person you're married to? Why does God have you dating the person you're dating? Why does God have you raising the kids He has you raising? Why does God have you where you are? Now maybe it's so you'll learn something and get out of there. You know, I mean, maybe that's the king. Maybe, and it's appropriate at times. Joseph ran away from Potiphar's wife, and that's appropriate sometimes. But sometimes it's important to sit and say, okay, what does God want to do in this environment through me? And maybe that's why He's got me here. God frequently uses people and circumstances that way. So the question is, will you take that risk? Will you take a step of action? Because you don't want to get to the end of your life and look back and see a string of missed opportunities. So Esther says yes. She fasts and she prays. Chapter 5, verse 1. On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. Now, what's going through her mind right now? Am I going to make it through this day? I mean, am I going to survive? I'm here. He might kill me. I mean, all that is rushing through her mind right now. What is going to happen? The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom it will be given to you." Now, that's probably a little bit hyperbole, like if Esther had said, "All right, I'll take half the kingdom." He probably would have changed his mind in a hurry. But this is his way of saying, I'm in a good mood. You get to have the remote control tonight, or something like that, you know. So, now, of course, Esther, in this situation, she can't just blurt out, I want you to repeal the unalterable law of the Medes and Persians and have your chief of staff killed. No, she doesn't, I mean, she doesn't want to just blurt that right out. So she thinks, what's the best way I can do this? So she knows the king pretty well, and she says, I'm throwing a party. I thought you might want to come. Oh, goody, I love a party, because the king loves the party. Okay, so he decides he wants to come to the party. Look at verse 6. As they were drinking wine at the party, the king again asked Esther, "Now what is your petition? It will be given you. And what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." And Esther replied, "My petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, then let the king and Haman come tomorrow to another party that I will prepare, and then I'll answer the king's question." And you see what she's done here? If he shows up by showing up to the party, he's pretty much obligated himself to say yes. If you're in a mood to say yes to my request, then come back tomorrow. And so she's pretty much got him to hand over a blank check to her, which is a habit, right? And that's what he did with Haman, and now it's pretty much what he's done for her as well. And now we're ready for the climax of the story, but the writer, so skillfully, he leaves us in suspense a little while longer. And he takes us and shows us a little bit more about this character, Haman. Okay? Verse 9. Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits, because he's drunk from the party. Okay. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. Why? Because he doesn't want anyone else to know that this guy gets under his skin, because appearance is so important to him, okay? I don't want anyone to know that this guy is really a burr in my saddle, but, oh, he burns me up, but I'm just going to swallow that down. I'm going to go home. Okay, so he goes home, and listen to what he says here, the end of verse 10. Calling together his friends and Zeresh, his wife, Haman boasted to all of them about his vast wealth. In other words, this is what's on the positive side of his ledger, okay? Vast wealth, his many sons, all the ways the king had honored him and how he'd elevated him above all the other nobles and officials. And that's not all, Haman added. I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave. And she's invited me along with the king tomorrow. Look at all the stuff on the positive side of his ledger. That's pretty good. I've got wealth. I've got status, I've got prestige, I've got a great family, I'm the king's favorite, I'm the only one who gets to go to this party with him, just the two of us, it's going to be, we're buddy-buddy. I've got all this on the positive side of my ledger. And look at this, verse 13. But all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. One thing on the negative side of the ledger outweighs everything on the positive side. Because that's what happens when you live for your image, and image maintenance becomes the highest priority. As long as there's one person out there who doesn't think the world revolves around you, your life is misery. Your life is a nightmare. Your life is awful. Yeah, but you got all this great stuff. I don't care about all that stuff. There's one guy out there. Who's in control of Mordecai's life? Haman. I'm sorry, the other way around. Who's in control of Haman's life? It's Mordecai, right? Instead of Haman controlling himself and being a self-directed person, he's given away all of his power to somebody else. And the interesting thing is, Mordecai probably doesn't even know. The person who keeps you up at night probably doesn't even know that what he's doing bothers you. And you get all twisted up in knots. She didn't even say hi to me. She must not like me. She's stuck up. I've always disliked her. And that car and the way she does her hair. And did you see the way she walks around like that? She has no idea that you're doing this, okay? She has no clue that what she does keeps you up at night. Ugh. But that's what happens when you give away all your power. Okay, so it's interesting because that's kind of life outside of the kingdom of God. I mean, Esther says, I am willing to die. If it kills me, it kills me. I'm willing to die for the sake of a cause that's bigger than I am. And Haman says, there is no cause bigger than I am. And if one person out there disagrees with me, I might as well just die. And that's pretty much life outside the kingdom of God. Okay? My life is miserable. This is interesting. Everyone, but especially people in positions of power, need a Mordecai who refuses to bow down. Because Haman could have learned a lot from Mordecai. But he didn't even let him. Never even occurred to him. Okay, verse 14. This is what happens when everyone around you defers to you. Verse 14. His wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, have a pole set up reaching to the height of 50 cubits and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it or hung from it. And then go with the king to the banquet and enjoy yourself. And this suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the pole set up, or he had these gallows built, okay? So what's interesting is he's going to go the next morning to ask permission to kill Mordecai. But then in chapter 6, what we find is that very night, while all that's going on over here, here's what's going on in the palace. See, this story is so well written. That night, the king could not sleep. He had insomnia. So he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. I can't sleep. Read me a bedtime story. What bedtime story will we read you? Read about my favorite story, me. So they go and they get the record, the official records, and they start reading to him. And listen, it was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed that plot, that assassination attempt, that two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. And the king says, what honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this? Nothing has been done for him, his attendants answered. So he starts thinking, we ought to give that guy a parade or something. Now, Haman shows up. Okay? Haman has no idea what's just happened. See how well crafted this story is? Haman has no clue about the insomnia in the story and all that kind of stuff. Haman just shows up, and this is what the king says. When Haman entered, verse 6, the king asked him, what should be done for the man who the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought to himself, who is there that the king would rather honor more than me? Because the world revolves around me, right? So he says, I better do this up right, because this could be like I could get him to give me another blank check. So he gives him all this great stuff. He says, well, king, I'm not one to really tell you how to do your job or anything, but if it was me, I'd do this right, okay? I'd really pull out all the stops and in verse 7, he says, "For the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head, and then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes, and let them robe the man the king delights to honor, and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, 'This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor.'" And the king says, "Wow, you're super smart. Why don't you go do all that for Mordecai?" This is not the way I had this planned out. That's what is going through Haman's head. What? No. Well, you know how it's supposed to sound and everything, and you knew it. Yeah, I mean, so you go do it. You be the guy, in fact. Yeah, that'll be great. You be the guy who actually leads Mordecai's horse around and tells everybody what a great guy Mordecai is. No! This is just killing him. Just got to be killing him. This is a reversal of fortune. And so Haman has to go do all that, and he's just humiliated, and then he has to go to the party, not in a real festive mood. Okay, verse 12. "Afterward, Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief and told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him." So he's very, very frustrated and disappointed. His advisors and his wife said to him, "Since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You'll surely come to ruin." And while they're still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther had prepared. So he gets there and he's angry, and he's so angry and frustrated. And finally, Xerxes says, "Enough, okay? We've been at the party, now this is the second day, and I'm here, and so I'm ready. Whatever you want, tell me what it is." And she says, "Okay." Chapter 7, verse 3. "Queen Esther answered, 'If I found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we'd been merely sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king.' And a king asked Queen Esther, 'Who is he? Where is he? The man who has dared to do such a thing?'" And now think about what Esther has to do. Esther has to name him, and he's sitting right there. Think about the courage that this takes. Are we supposed to be done? We got 5 minutes, right? Do we have 5 minutes? No, we're supposed to be done right now? Oh, how frustrating. No? Go? Okay, all right. I apologize. Okay, I apologize. We're going to go 5 minutes over. Okay, so she has to name him this requires a lot of bravery. Look at verse 6. "An adversary and enemy, this vile Haman." And she actually names him. "And then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen." And long story short, okay, Haman ends up being hanged on the very gallows that he built for Mordecai. Okay? But that's not it, okay? As if that weren't ironic enough, now the king says, "I need a new chief of staff. Who will it be?" And Esther arranges for Mordecai to become the new chief of staff. Talk about reversal of fortune. This is what is known in the Bible as the law of inversion, and we'll learn more about it in the life of Jesus. Jesus says it over and over again. First will be last, last will be first. Whoever humbles himself will be exalted, and whoever exalts himself will be humbled. God frequently comes along and practices this law of inversion. And so, I mean, it's really interesting because then Esther reminds Xerxes, there's still this law on the books, and in a couple of months we're supposed to be killed. And Xerxes, look at chapter 8, verse 8. Xerxes says this. He says to Esther and Mordecai, "Write another decree in the king's name." In other words, here, you write it. That's just so what he does. Here, you write it, whatever sounds good to you. And so they write such a strong reversal of this law that, where is it? Look at verse 17, chapter 8, verse 17. It says, "In every province and in every city to which the edict of the king came, there was joy and gladness among the Jews with feasting and celebrating, and many people of other nationalities became Jews because the fear of the Jews had seized them." So the people who were supposed to be annihilated are the people who get feared now. The people who were the least in the kingdom now become the people who are the greatest. The Jews are not destroyed, they're elevated. The law of inversion is operable in God's kingdom, where the poor become rich, and the weak become strong, and the least become the greatest. And this is the interesting thing to me, okay? The Medes and the Persians thought their law was unalterable, and they were wrong. But there is a law that is unalterable. And they thought the king's will could not be bent, and they were wrong. But there is a king whose will cannot be bent. And even though it happens in hidden, unseen, behind-the-scenes sorts of ways, God is inevitably working. God is inevitably moving history towards its ultimate climax. And no matter how dark it has gotten throughout the course of the Old Testament, and we've seen it get real dark sometimes, killing the baby boys in Egypt, the threat of the destruction of the entire race of the Jews, no matter how dark it has seemed to get, God is always at work, and His will not be thwarted. The question for us is, do you want to get on board? Because God's going to do what God's going to do with or without you. The opportunity presents itself for you to sign up to participate in God's story. So you could be like King Xerxes, or you could be like Haman, and you could say, I'm going to be the star of my own show. Now, the problem with that is if you're going to be the star of your own show, you get to write it and direct it and produce it and finance it yourself. And it'll be a short story. It won't end very well, okay? No matter how high you might get for a little while, it's always going to end badly. Or you can choose to participate in God's never-ending story that began in eternity past and is moving towards eternity in the future. And that's the opportunity that presents itself. God, I mean, you think about everything that's happened here. Of all the women in the kingdom, why Esther? Of all the women, why Esther? And of all the officials to have discovered this plot, why Mordecai? And of all the nights for the king to have insomnia, why the very night that Haman is building the gallows? And of all the stories for them to pick out of the chronicles of his reign, why this story about Mordecai? How is it that Haman ends up getting hanged on his own gallows and Mordecai ends up as his replacement? How is it that the Jews who were supposed to be destroyed end up being the Jews who were feared? It reads like Shakespeare. It really does. Is all this a coincidence? Not on your life. Because even in exile, even though he's unnamed, God is at work. And the whole book of Esther, by the way, ends with a big party. Isn't that appropriate? Only this time they do it upright. And they do it for the right reasons. Listen, God is at work. And God is looking for people who will partner with Him in His work. And those people are going to look like Jesus. Those people who will enlist to partner with Him are going to submit to this refining process. And can you imagine what it would be like if everybody here said, I'm signing up for that. I'm not going to just be a participant in my own story. I'm willing to play a bit part, if that's what it takes, to move the plot line of history forward towards this ultimate climax, this ultimate moment when all things that have been hidden will be revealed and everything that is presently upside down gets turned right side up. Can you imagine what this community of people would look like if we all said, no matter what the circumstances that come my way, I'm going to choose to see this as an opportunity for growth. And I'm going to sign up to be in community with people who will not just make me feel comfortable, but will frequently challenge me to stop setting the bar so low. I'm going to engage in spiritual disciplines, and I'm going to take steps of responsible action to keep life from happening to me. Can you imagine what a community of people who lived like that would look like? Let's pray. God, I believe that can happen here. I believe that you are at work. Whether we acknowledge it or not, whether we see it or not, whether we name it or not, you are at work among us. You're at work in my life and in the lives of so many people in this room, and we could all go around and we could tell stories about things that you have done in our lives. God, we ask that you will give us eyes to see, that you'll open the eyes of our hearts so that we can see how high and deep and wide and all-consuming is the love that you have for us. And God, open our eyes to see opportunities for growth, opportunities to participate with you in advancing the borders of your kingdom in our generation. That's our prayer tonight in the name of Jesus. Amen.